George Russell takes home his first win of the season and first win since Vegas of last year. Max Verstappen P2, Kimi Antonelli with his first podium of his career, finishing in P3. It should be a day all about Mercedes, getting their first win of the season, what it means for the team, what it means for the rest of the season. But instead, we're talking about McLaren because we finally got that moment. Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris come together at the end of the race. We'll talk about all of that, who was in the right, who was in the wrong, the aftermath, what it means for the rest of the season, and some more headlines coming out of the Canadian Grand Prix. Another surprisingly good day for some of the midfield teams. All of this coming next on the Chicanery Podcast. Don't worry, we're going to get to the McLarens very quickly, but it feels wrong to not start with George Russell, coming away from this weekend with his first win of the season, and the first win for Mercedes this season as well. Looking at this weekend for George, though, it all started in qualifying. And we hear about it from drivers all the time. It's so difficult to put together that perfect lap in qualifying. You make a little mistake here, you make a little mistake there, it's a 10th here, a 10th there. It might be great, but it's not perfect. But what George did on Saturday was the perfect qualifying lap. And you could tell based on his radio message right after he crossed the start-finish line and waiting for the team to tell him whether he got pole or not, looking at the time on his screen, knowing he got everything out of that car, knowing it was a 110 and it was good enough to be on pole. This was a special lap from George. And it was one where he left nothing on the table and there was nothing left to pull out of that car. And that qualifying lap is really what laid the foundation for him to win this race on Sunday. Because you look at this race, and you look at the start specifically, this is where George won the race. Now, of course, a lot of the race, too, came down to pace and, just how he managed the tires and managed the rest of the stints throughout the race. But if George lets Max beat him off the line, or lets anyone else behind him beat him off the line, and gets behind in dirty air, he's probably not getting back ahead in winning this race. So a lot of credit comes down to George with this race start, and it's a tricky start. Like I talked about in the race preview episode, it's a short run down to turn one, and it's one where you have to nail the reaction time in the initial start off the line because there's no second phase. So if you don't get that initial start off the line right, there's a good chance a car behind you who does get that start right will have enough to get around you and get along the outside going into turn one, have the inside line going into turn two, and take the lead from there. But George coming off the start-finish line when the lights went out, I think the reaction time for him was 0.24 seconds. For Max in second, it was 0.30. So small margins, but enough for George to get ahead and just completely close the door on Max. And Max really didn't even have any opportunity to get around George going into that first turn. But after that, George, of course, comes away with the lead coming out of turn two. And it was his race to lose. And it was a race he managed beautifully from start to finish. And honestly, not only was it George and his race pace and just his management throughout the race, but a lot of credit goes to the Mercedes pit wall with strategy calls too. Because Max comes in, I think it was on lap 13 for his first pit stop, and you're looking at it thinking, this is way too early. Something's got to be wrong with the Red Bull. And then Mercedes brings George in right away to cover that pit stop, and you're thinking, this isn't good. There's a good chance you guys probably just threw away the rest of your race, and you're either going to have to go way too long on your second or third stints, or you're going to run out of tires at the end of the race, and it's going to be something that we look back and say, yep, that's what cost you there. But it was the right call for Mercedes to make, and it allowed George to cover off Max, but also to cover off anyone else behind him as well. And once those pit stops cycled through, George is back up in front again, and he's able to control the pace of the race and can just manage the rest of the race from there. So a lot of credit not only goes to George for his race pace and race management, but a lot of credit goes to the Mercedes pit wall for their strategy calls as well. But George, going to his race pace and the management throughout the race, he handled it very, very well. And there are a lot of times in the past where we've seen George under this pressure of being out in front and just cracking under the pressure, kind of like we see from other drivers named Lando Norris, but it was something that we've seen from George in the past, and it was something that was non-existent this race. And there were moments, too, where Max was closing up the gap behind George, and George was coming under a little pressure. I think in that final stint at the end of the race, there was one point where I don't know if Max was within DRS range of George, but he was close within, I think, 1.1, 1.2 seconds. So Max was closing the gap. In George, next thing we know, when that gap appeared, George is back up in front, 2 seconds ahead. So it was a race where he really controlled from start to finish, and really just, there was no doubt that he was going to win this race. There were a few moments where, okay, if, we get a mistimed safety car or red flag and, he gets screwed that way. But any driver in that position would get screwed. But George was in control from Saturday to Sunday. And this was a race win that he'll remember for a long time. It was a very well-deserved race win. It wasn't just good news on his side of the garage for Mercedes, though. On the other side, Kimi Antonelli takes home his first podium of his F1 career, and a very well-deserved podium for him as well. It was a moment we knew was coming at some point this season. Kimi is a very, very special driver, and you knew this moment was going to happen. But looking at Kimi's race too, it was another one that was set up on Saturday and won with the start of the race. Of course, Kimi, qualifies P4, lines up on the second row alongside Oscar Piastri, but gets ahead of the Ferraris in qualifying, gets ahead of Lando Norris, gets ahead of everyone else, and it was a little higher than we expect Kimi to see. Because usually he's somewhere qualifying P5, P6, P7, P8. He's well off the pace from George. But this weekend, Kimi got it right in qualifying. But not only was it qualifying, that race start off the line was crucial for Kimi. Much better start than Oscar, allows him to get alongside Oscar going into turn 1, and get that inside line going into turn 2, and get around Oscar ultimately. And I think that was crucial for Kimi getting this podium. If he stays behind Oscar and doesn't get behind him, very good chance we're seeing Oscar on the podium coming away with P3. And, of course, that would lead to another domino falling or not falling, where we don't get this crash between Oscar and Lando. But we'll talk about that later. But for Kimi, great start off the line. But after that, too, it wasn't just the start. Kimi handled the pressure of being in this third position, having cars behind him hunt him down beautifully, especially at the end of the third stint and final stint at the end of the race. Oscar was closing the gap on Kimi. And you were watching it thinking, all right, it's only a matter of time. Kimi's going to get passed by Oscar. Maybe he even gets passed by Lando too. But he handled that pressure beautifully. Navigating not only that pressure, but navigating traffic of the lap cars as well, which might need to talk about that for a second. I don't know if it was this track. I don't know if it was the lap cars and what they were doing. It seemed like there was a lot of impeding. And of course, nothing ever went to the stewards. Nothing was ever noted or anything like that or under investigation. But there are a lot of moments where there are faster cars at the top trying to get around lap traffic. And you're watching this lap traffic kind of get in the way thinking, move, like what are you guys doing? But again, nothing went to the stewards. Nothing was under investigation or noted. So, no ill intent or nothing that was done wrong there. But just weird situations with lap traffic throughout this race at multiple points. But again, going back to Kimi, great job navigating the traffic while dealing with all the pressure of these cars hunting him down behind him. This was a special one for Kimi. And I don't know if we're going to get a race win out of him this season, but I think there's a good chance we get some more podiums out of him. And I think if we don't get it this season, there's a good chance that race win for Kimi Antonelli is not far in the future. All right. Let's talk about the McLarens. We knew this moment was going to happen. Probably since last year when they really started putting themselves in contention and we knew that they were competing for race wins against each other. But we knew at some point Lando and Oscar were going to come together on track. And honestly, it took a little longer than most of us thought it would. But I feel like we need to start with Saturday with these two drivers because with Lando again, it's a trend that we're seeing way too much with him, where he just cracks under the pressure of Q3. And, it's concerning for Lando because there's so many instances where he looks like the stronger driver in the free practice sessions. He looks like the stronger driver in Q1. He looks like the stronger driver in Q2. But everything comes down to Q3. And we know unless something terribly, goes wrong terribly with these two drivers, both of these McLarens are going to get into Q3. And whoever gets pole, and ultimately whoever gets the better race result, is going to come down to who handles that final Q3 run better. And time again, we see it come down to it with these two drivers, and Oscar handles the pressure great, and Lando cracks under the pressure. And that's what happened on Saturday, yet again, with these two. And what makes this sting even more with Lando is Oscar wasn't even having the best weekend. He was having a weekend where he crashed again in the practice sessions, had that brush with the Wall of Champions. And we saw this in Monaco, where Oscar crashed and, runs long going into the first turn in Monaco, crashes into the barriers. And Oscar, coming out of that race weekend, admitted that crash really affected him the rest of the weekend and caused him to lose some confidence. And it happens again this weekend, and you think, all right, it's another opportunity for Lando to get ahead of Oscar and really come away with a better race result coming out of this weekend. And he blows it in qualifying. And it's just a trend that is just continuing to happen and continuing to build on Lando's side of the garage. And it's something that's really going to hurt him and can just continue to hurt him, something that's already hurt him. But just for this championship fight, stuff that cannot happen with Lando. But it happened again on Saturday. It starts with the first run of Q3. Of course, with this one, it's not the lap where he expects to win pole off of or anything like that, but it's a good banker lap, and it's one that goes a long way with drivers' confidence. And Lando, coming into the final chicane, blows it, goes off track. Of course, his lap time gets invalidated. He does end up getting another banker lap in before that final Q3 run, but it was one that was a lot slower because, of course, he's on the used tires, much slower after that first run that he blew. So just not the type of lap that Lando needs coming out of those first few runs of Q3. And it was very obvious that this, completely threw off his confidence going into that final run of Q3 as well. And the broadcast didn't show it, but it was clear looking at the timing. Lando had some incident going off, maybe not off track, but, going off the racing line and losing a lot of time in that second sector. And he didn't even improve on his final run in Q3. So really put himself on the back foot going into Sunday's race, qualifying all the way back into P7. But again, Oscar only qualifies P3. There's an opportunity for Lando to get ahead of Oscar. Not even qualified on pole. P2, P3, bump Oscar back into P4. But Lando missed the mark yet again. And it really put him on the back foot going into Sunday. But another thing that makes this race result hurt so much, and we'll get into how it all unfolded and how it all ended for Lando, but this was a very good recovery drive from him. And we see that all the time when he has these incidents in qualifying where he makes it up during the race and he has incredible race pace. And you think, man, if you would have just gotten it right in qualifying, this could have been so much better. You could have come out with the race win or at least ahead of Oscar. And it makes these moments sting so much more for Lando. But now again, a lot of this I think came down to tire strategy too. They were on the alternate strategies. Lando starts on the hard tires. Oscar starts on the medium tires. So Lando has the opportunity to go much, much longer on that first stint. And Oscar, went much more shorter than expected on the medium stint. But also too on that, Oscar's doing the medium stint on much higher fuel loads where Lando has the mediums on the second stint, much lower fuel loads. So he's able to extend that medium stint a little bit longer too. So a little bit of an advantage there for Lando. But also too, Oscar's dealing with some lap traffic that allows Lando to close the gap too. But even with that, a great recovery drive from Lando up until the final 5-6 laps of the race. So he puts himself in this great position to, control the damage a little bit with Oscar in the poor qualifying result and at least minimize the points difference. If Oscar finishes fourth, if Lando finishes fifth, it's just 2 extra points that Oscar gets in the championship. But Lando's closing the gap. Looks like he has stronger pace. Of course, he has a little bit of a tire advantage too. And it's starting to get to that point where you're thinking, does Lando have the opportunity to get by Oscar and get ahead of Oscar and steal a few points back from him too? And it looked like that too with the lap traffic coming into play. With Oscar, trying to keep up with Kimi, but then Kimi's getting around lap traffic. Lap traffic's getting away ahead of Oscar, and that's dropping Oscar back into Lando's clutches. And Lando closes the gap, and he gets within a second. He gets within that DRS range. And it took a couple laps for him to actually pose a serious threat to Oscar, but it got to that point where you're thinking, all right, something interesting is going to happen. We're finally going to get that wheel-to-wheel racing between these two drivers that we've been waiting for this entire season. So let's start, I believe it was lap 66, where all of this really unfolded. We'll start with Lando's first move, going into turn 10. He dives bomb Oscar, going on the inside of turn 10. Looking at the move, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Now, a lot of people, depending on what side of the fence you're on, think it was, a dirty move from Lando. Why is he doing that on his teammate? Does he even expect to pass Oscar at that point? I don't know if he expected to pass Oscar at that point and come out of turn 10 ahead. But even not, I don't think it was a bad strategy call from Lando to do that and throw Oscar off of his racing line, compromise his exit out of turn 10, going into that final stretch, going into the final chicane of turns 13 and 14. I think it was a good move from Lando. And I think that really put him in a position, and we saw that where they come out of turns 10 and 11, and they're side by side. And interesting, too, they both have DRS. Of course, Lando has it from Oscar in front of him. Oscar has it from Kimi because he's still within a second of Kimi in front of him as well. So they're going down this final stretch, going into turns 11, turn 12, side by side, DRS open. You know something's going to happen. And Lando starts to edge a little bit ahead, but all right, somebody's going to have to back out first. Who's it going to be? And it was Lando backing out first. And I think that was the right move by Lando too, because if he stays ahead, or not stays ahead, but stays side by side of Oscar going into turns 13 and 14, there's a good chance Lando gets run off the road and gets sent into the runoff area. And that, of course, would most likely put Lando far enough back from Oscar where he's not within DRS range anymore. That puts us at 3 or 4 laps left. So probably not enough time for him to catch back up to Oscar and not only catch back up, but get ahead. But then also, too, going off track, he's going to go onto the dirty marbles. That's really going to ruin his tires, take a couple laps to clear that off of his tires. So, it was a smart decision by Lando to back off in that moment, because if he didn't, it's probably all over at that point, and his chances are out the window. So he backs off. Oscar comes out of turn 14 ahead, but Lando's right there, and he has the better run coming out of that final chicane. He has the DRS assistance as well that Oscar doesn't have, and it looks like Lando's going to have a run. But instead, Lando decides to go to the inside. I don't really know why he did, because it seems, just logistically speaking, go to the outside. You're going to be on the outside going into turn 1, but that's going to give you the inside lane going into turn 2, and that's going to be where your advantage is, and that's going to be, if you can stay alongside going into turn 1, and you have the inside line going into turn 2, you're probably going to have enough to get ahead of him, and Lando probably would have had enough to get ahead of Oscar at that point. But instead, Lando opts for the inside line, and this was very eerily similar to what we saw with Jenson Button and Lewis Hamilton in 2 McLaren cars at the same part of this track in 2011. When Jenson, I think it was Jenson who ran Lewis off the road. Of course, Lewis gets damage. Very, very similar incident, very weird circumstances, that both of these incidents happen at the same part of the track on the same team. But Lando goes on the inside, and he went for a gap that just wasn't there. Everybody saw it. Even, you look at the cool down room with the top 3, they're watching the race highlights, and, this incident gets shown, and they say it right away of, wasn't really a gap there, was there? And there wasn't. This was completely on Lando, and just a move he shouldn't have made. And credit to Lando, too, for getting on the radio right away and saying, hey, guys, this was on me. I apologize to the team. I apologize to Oscar. This was a stupid mistake. It was a silly mistake. It was one I shouldn't have made. And I think that did go a long way with the team. I think it would be a much different situation if Lando had a different reaction to that and said, oh, Oscar ran me off track, or, pointed the finger at the team or something else. This was on him. And it was right on Lando to point the finger at himself right away after this. And I think it really would have been detrimental to the team for the rest of the season if it was a different reaction from Lando. And there just would have been a lot of backlash and a lot of bad blood coming away from this. But so credit to Lando for that, coming out, raising his hand, taking responsibility for it. But this is a mistake that is really going to hurt him for the rest of the championship. And I'm not saying Oscar won the championship today. We still have 14 more races to go. There's a long, long way to go. It's only a 22-point lead. But worst case scenario, if Lando stays in this race, Oscar goes ahead. He extends his championship lead from 10 points to 12 points. Not that bad. But instead, with Lando going out, Oscar extends that lead from 10 points to 22 points. Again, it's not a huge lead, but when you consider how close these two drivers are, a typical McLaren result is P1, P2, P1, P3, P2, P4. They're close. There's not a lot of separation between these two. There's very fine margins between these race results. It's going to take a lot for Lando to make up this ground to Oscar. Unless Oscar has a surprise DNF, mechanical failure, something where, he falls out of the points, kind of similar to what we saw from him in Australia, Lando needs one of those situations to happen to really bring himself back into contention for this championship. Because if not, what is he going to have to do? Just slowly chip away and chip away and chip away, and 2-point gains, 3-point gains, 5-point gains, if that. And that means he's going to have to beat Oscar in qualifying. That means he's going to have to beat Oscar in the races, which is not a given based on what we've seen from Oscar this year. It's a really, really tough battle for Lando, and just an uphill climb for him to really put himself back in contention for this championship. Tough weekend for Lando. It started in qualifying. He had a decent race. It was a good recovery drive. But that mistake to go along the inside of Oscar is really, really going to cost him. Not a bad Sunday for Max Verstappen and Red Bull. I think it was a little bit of a surprising result. Looking at where they were going through the practice sessions, going into qualifying. Of course, Max in qualifying, you always know he has a chance of putting together a pole lap, and he's always going to be somewhere at the top. But going through the practice sessions especially, looking at how the Red Bull was performing, it looked like there were going to be issues for Sunday, especially with tire degradation and especially with race pace. But Max just didn't have that this race. And credit to Yuki, too, on his side of the garage. He had a pretty good recovery drive. Of course, he finished P12, so he's not in the points. Little disappointing for him as far as that's concerned. And, he was handed a pretty big grid drop because of a red flag incident during the practice sessions. But he had some pace, too. And he was able to get around a lot of cars and at least try to make the most out of that drive and out of that start. But Max had a great race starting in P2, and even with him starting that high, slotting in behind George to start the race, you thought, okay, Kimi's probably going to catch him. The McLarens are probably going to catch him at some point too. Maybe even the Ferraris have a chance at catching him. He's just going to fall back in the order. And he didn't. He was consistently in that P2 slot. And there were parts too of the race where it looked like Max actually had a chance at winning, especially the end of the race. And he said in the cool-down room, too, the first few stints were a little tricky for him. But that last stint was very, very strong. And it looked like Max had a good chance of catching George and getting ahead of George for that race win. Now, of course, again, I think George was saving a little bit there and just letting Max get close enough to maybe, burn through his tires a little bit, too, and, just kind of throw him off a little bit in that aspect. But a lot of credit goes to Max for staying up there at the top, staying within reach of George, and really coming away with a strong P2 finish. A good result for Red Bull this weekend, and one that you never know with this car, though. There are tracks where it looks like this, where they can, come away with a race win or at least be somewhere at the top. There are tracks where they just are completely fallen off and, look nowhere near the top. So I think things are trending in the right direction based on some of the upgrades that Red Bull's brought. But at least with Max, he's always going to give you a chance for a race win or at least for a podium. And with this whole incident with Lando, closes the gap up a little bit with him and at least brings him closer to that P2 slot in the driver's standings. Going to Yuki Tsunoda, again, he had a tough break with the qualifying. Really something that falls on him with the red flag incident where he passed Oscar Piastri under the red flag. Just a stupid mistake by him. And just a lapse in judgment, one he should know. I really don't know what was going through his mind at that point. Just unnecessary. I mean, you're under a red flag. You're not trying to put together a lap or anything like that and get to the finish line. Just stay behind Oscar. You're getting back to the pits. It really doesn't matter at the end of the way. But again, just a lapse in judgment from him. Puts him all the way back to start the race. Of course, we had a couple drivers, I think it was Liam Lawson and Pierre Gasly starting from the pit lane because of just engine component changes coming out of Parc Ferme. So that puts Yuki starting in 18th. So to get up to 12th, decent result there, but still not one that Red Bull is necessarily going to be happy with. This is a team that needs to see their second driver in the points, and they understand how difficult it is to drive this second Red Bull car and just all of the problems that come with that and just come with being Max Verstappen's teammate. But we've seen it prior weekends where Yuki's crashing out, making these mistakes, and this one, It wasn't a costly mistake as far as damage is concerned, and repair costs, but it was costly as far as his starting position and getting that grid penalty. Because if he didn't, I think that would have put him P11 to start, if I remember right. So again, not exactly where Red Bull wants him to be, but still a position where, he would have had the opportunity to get ahead of a lot more cars ahead of him and get into the points and get somewhat of a decent finish away from this race. But Yuki finishing out of the points yet again, just not the type of result he needs. And one that, again, I don't think this is a situation where Yuki's going to lose his sleep, or excuse me, not lose his sleep, lose his seat at some point throughout the season. But it's something that's going to hurt his chances for next year, because you have Isaac Hadjar putting in the performances he is. I don't know if Liam Lawson is necessarily a threat, but you have Arvid Lindblad in F2, who they've got the super license for now. They can bring up at any point. So, again, that was more so to protect them, I think, for Max getting a race ban, but still, he's there. And you never know what's going to happen with Yuki, especially with these results. But it's something he has to turn around, especially as he goes into the European summer. He's got to get into the points. He can't have these situations where he's starting so far back because of poor qualifying or because of a crash or because of a penalty. He has to start further up the grid, and he has to finish further up the grid if he wants to be in Red Bull coming out of this year. Going to some of the other teams, kind of middle of the pack result for Ferrari. Charles Leclerc finishes P5. Lewis Hamilton finishes P6. For Lewis, though, apparently he hit a groundhog on lap 13. There is some footage of it. Again, you don't see anything too terribly, but you definitely see the groundhog and you see his car going over it. So, and the team reported this throughout the race too, that he had some floor damage. Of course, it all adds up. It makes sense. And this is something that notoriously happens at this track with all the groundhogs around. They come out, they get run over, it damages a car, and it can ruin a race. And that's what happened to Lewis this weekend. So, tough break for him. And, it's hard to exactly, gauge his race based on that because he was losing so much time. I think they said he was losing 20 points of downforce because of that damage. So, just something that put him on the back foot right away. But, credit to him. If it wasn't for the McLaren incident, it would have been a P7 result. So, not great, but with that damage, a decent result. And he at least kept all of the midfield teams behind him. For Leclerc, though, they went with the alternate strategy, starting on hard tires there. And I think it was a good strategy call to go with, starting on the hard tires. And, being in that position, saying, hey, what have we got to lose? Let's do the alternate strategy. Maybe things go our way. Maybe all of a sudden we're up at the top. And Leclerc had a decent race. But a really weird strategy call from Ferrari, where Leclerc comes in. It's obvious he's trying to extend that first stint on the hards as much as he can, and maybe even push it where they can do the one stop. But Leclerc comes in for that first stop. I think it was lap 27. And Ferrari puts him on another set of hards. Doesn't make sense at all. And Leclerc jumped on the radio right away, questioning the call, saying, what is this tire choice? What are we doing? Again, I don't think it mattered too much at the end of the race. I think Leclerc would have finished P5. Of course, it would have been a P6 with Lando not crashing out. But he would have finished in the same spot if they went with that medium tire choice for the second stint. But just the strategy call in that moment. On lap 27, you bring him into the pits. Put him on the mediums. Now, of course, there's probably, a very, very small chance that he can extend the medium tires all the way until the end of the race and make that one stop work, but just give him a chance to at least make it happen. Maybe you get a red flag. Maybe you get a safety car that gives you a cheap pit stop and lets you go back on the hard tires, which also look like the better tires at most parts of the race throughout the race on Sunday as well. But it just, going on to the hard tires basically guarantees that you're doing a two-stop. It doesn't make sense. Give yourself at least the chance to do the one stop or the chance to capitalize on some chaos with the red flag or who knows what else. But instead, they go with the hard tires. They guarantee themselves a medium or a second stop. And it basically locked them into that strategy call. And it was one that it didn't really matter at the end of the day. but it didn't make a lot of sense in the moment, and it was just the pit wall demons coming back for Ferrari yet again. But again, they come away with P5, P6, decent points for them considering where they are this season, but still, it's disappointing that this is where Ferrari is this season. A P5, P6 is a good result for them. They're not really thinking about podiums. They're just thinking about staying ahead of the midfield teams, and it's just not where this team expected to be. Mixed results for some of the midfield teams. We'll start with Aston Martin. Fernando Alonso finishes P7. Another great result from him. He's had so many good races this year where something happens with a crash and damage or a mechanical failure or just something going wrong that takes him out of the points where it looks like he should finish in the points. So for Fernando to come away with P7, really, really good race for him. And another one that he set himself up for this with qualifying. Now, on the other side of the garage, his teammate, Lance Stroll, finishes P17, which was the last car to cross the finish line out of the cars that actually finished the race. Not good for him. And just a trend that we continue to see where Fernando, I think I saw something, it's 22 straight weekends that Fernando's out-qualified Lance. Not good. But Lance, coming back from this wrist surgery or wrist procedure, whatever he did, it was obvious to me it affected him. He was still able to race the car. He was still able to finish the race, but his pace was just way, way off and just not where you needed it to be. But again, it's his home race. He's Canadian. It was going to take a lot for him to miss this. And his dad is the owner of the team, so his dad makes the decisions. And if Lance wanted to race, Lance was going to race. But again, just mixed bag of emotions for Aston Martin, coming away with a P7 on one side of the garage, P17 for the other. But at least for Fernando, he finally gets, well, not finally because he got it last weekend too, but he continues to get a points finish when he should be getting a points finish. Going to Sauber, they continue the good trend as well. Nico Hülkenberg finishes P8. Another great points finish for them. Gabriel Bortoleto, of course, finishes P14, so a little further back in the order for him too. But for Nico, another strong result, and another one where Sauber, they finished on the lead lap too, which was another good sign for them. But coming out of the Flexi Wing technical directive changes, it looks like this has benefited Sauber greatly. All of a sudden, they're back up there at the top with the midfield teams, at least Nico Hülkenberg. So again, another good result for them, and another one that could pay huge dividends in the constructor standings later down the line. Esteban Ocon finishes P9. His teammate, Ollie Behrman, finishes P11. Of course, Ollie would have liked to finish in the points, I'm sure, but a very good result for these two Haas drivers. One finishing in the points, the other one finishing close enough to the points, but much better than I expected them to do this weekend. And a very, very good result for them, and a very promising result going into the rest of the summer. Really weird weekend for Williams. Carlos Sainz finishes P10. Of course, he had that incident in qualifying. Tough break for him, where it was clear Isaac Hadjar impeded him in qualifying and impeded him on that final run of Q1, which probably would have been enough for Carlos to get into Q2. But of course, he impedes him, and there's nothing that Carlos can do about it. He loses that lap time, knocks him out in Q1, and I think he started 16th or 17th. I think 16th based on how all the penalties shook out in the grid drops, but in reality he qualified 17th. But really good recovery drive from him too, to make it all the way back up into the points. Now, for his teammate, Alex Albon, another tough race. And we keep seeing this with Alex too, where there are a lot of radio messages with him where he's not happy at all with his side of the garage and the strategy calls that are being made. And it just seems like the team's not listening to him. But with Alex, that strategy call for him, it looks like they left him out a little bit too late. He wanted to come in, get off of those medium tires right away, kind of when everyone else was getting in. The team said, no, we're keeping you out. And then they wanted to bring him in, I think it was like 10 laps later at that point. And at that point, Alex was like, you guys have left me out too long. We might as well stay out so I can see if I can do the one stop. It looked like they had a chance at kind of maybe recovering in making that one stop work. But again, at the end of the race, actually not the end of the race, I think it was around lap 45, if I remember right, 44, 45, 46, somewhere in there. Alex has the engine failure. Ruins his race, end of the race for him. Concerning trend for Mercedes power units. we have been seeing a lot of engine failures in a generation where we don't really see engine failures anymore. I don't know what's going on, but there are a lot of teams that use Mercedes power units, including McLaren, which really makes you think, is anything going to happen to them at some point this season? But tough break for Alex because it looks like he had a chance to maybe finish in the points if he didn't have that engine failure. Franco Colapinto finally finishes ahead of his teammate Pierre Gasly. Of course, he finishes P13, Pierre finishes P15, so not a stellar result for him, not one where he's in the points, and a pretty bad result for Pierre Gasly too, but at least Franco finishes ahead of his teammate, and at least it gives him something to say, maybe I belong here. Maybe things aren't as bad as the team thinks. So we'll see. It's something Franco needs to build on, and he needs to get better results. He needs to get into the points, and he needs to qualify ahead of his teammate consistently, or at least put up a fight. But he really needs to get into the points to just handle those expectations that are placed upon him by Flavio Briatore. Because we're at, gosh, I can't remember how many races, but it was rumored he only had 5 races. So we're getting close to that point where, if that is true, decision time is coming. So we'll see what happens with Franco. But he needed at least a result where he finished ahead of his teammate, and he got that this weekend. Last team I want to touch on, the Racing Bulls. Tough weekend for them. I expected a lot better from them, especially with, just how strong we've seen them. They've looked like the best of the rest a lot of races. But P16 for Isaac Hadjar, retirement for Liam Lawson. Tough weekend for them. Not the weekend they wanted. And with Isaac, of course, he got that impeding penalty that really put him on his back foot to start the race. But they just didn't have any pace this weekend. And it was a tough race for them. Of course, Liam just never looked like he had the pace either, and then was forced into that retirement where the team, I think they said at the end of it, they just needed to protect the power unit. So not the weekend they wanted. Liam, he's got to start turning this around. He's got to start getting better results than his teammate Isaac Hadjar, because it's just not looking good for him. And Isaac being as young as he is, Red Bull having as many young drivers as they do in their development program, Liam's going to get pushed to the side. They're not going to hold on to Liam unless he shows some promise. And again, just like Yuki, I think Liam stays there the rest of the season. I don't think he's at risk of losing his seat at any point during the season. But going into next year, if he wants to stick around in Formula One, he's got to turn things around. All right, that'll do it for today's episode recapping the Canadian Grand Prix. For a while there, it looked like it was going to be an uneventful strategy-type race, but thanks to those 2 Papaya drivers, we've got a lot to talk about over the next 2 weeks as we head to Austria, which is the next race on the calendar, and we will be back with another episode, of course, off next weekend, but right before the following weekend, I'll be back with a preview episode of the Austrian Grand Prix, and then, of course, a recap episode on Sunday, going over everything we saw during that race weekend. I'm very excited to see how this all unfolds. Again, I don't think it's going to be very detrimental on McLaren with this crash and this incident, but I'm very interested to see how Lando bounces back from this, especially where his confidence is coming out of this race weekend. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.